Antonia wrote history as if she were gossiping, and gossiping as if she were writing epics. This wasn't just a witty remark from Truman Capote. It was the perfect paradoxical key to understanding Lady Antonia Fraser. She was the dazzling aristocratic beauty who became a powerhouse historian, a mother of six, who resurrected the lives of tragic queens, and a high society insider who understood the secrets of the past better than anyone. Her genius was to recognize that the greatest historical events are often driven by the most intimate human whispers, the stuff of gossip. This is the story of how a young woman born into a world of privilege and fierce intellect forged a unique voice that would change the way we read history. We will explore the life behind the legend to uncover the woman who could turn a secret into a masterpiece. To understand the young Antonia Fraser, one must understand the Britain she was born into, a nation standing at a profound crossroads. The Britain of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s was a country grappling with its own identity. The Second World War had been won, but the cost was immense, leaving a legacy of austerity, rationing, and a palpable sense of national exhaustion. The vast British Empire, once a source of immense pride and power, was beginning to crumble, its colonies agitating for and winning independence. This slow decline created a crisis of confidence within the British establishment. Socially, the rigid class structures that had defined the nation for centuries were beginning to show cracks, but they were far from broken. The aristocracy, while diminished in political power and often financially strained, still held immense cultural sway. Rituals like the London season, where debutantes like Antonia were presented at court, continued as if nothing had changed, a beautiful nostalgic echo of a bygone era. Yet bubbling beneath this surface of tradition was a new, rebellious energy. In politics, the Labour Party, with its vision of a welfare state, had achieved a historic victory in 1945, challenging the Conservative Party's long-held grip on power. In literature, the angry young men were railing against the stuffiness of the establishment. It was a time of immense tension and transition, a battle between the old guard and the new, between tradition and modernity. It was into this complex, contradictory, and fascinating world that Antonia Pakenham was born, a child of the old aristocracy, but also the daughter of one of the Labour Party's most prominent and unconventional figures, placing her at the very heart of this national conversation. Antonia's story does not begin in a quiet, stately home, but in a whirlwind of intellectual and political fervor. She was born in 1932, the eldest of 8 children, into the remarkable Pakenham family, who would later hold the title of the Earls of Longford. To understand Antonia, one must first understand her extraordinary parents, for they were the twin sons around which her early universe revolved. Her father was Frank Pakenham, the 7th Earl of Longford. He was a figure who defied all easy categorization. An Anglo-Irish aristocrat by birth, he was also a devout Catholic convert, a socialist, a leading politician in the Labour Party, and a tireless, often controversial social reformer. He was a man of immense intellect, deep compassion, and a legendary eccentricity. He was famous for his passionate, sometimes quixotic campaigns, most notably for prison reform, which saw him befriending and advocating for some of Britain's most notorious criminals, including the Moors murderer Myra Hindley. To the press, he was often Lord Looney, but to his family, he was a figure of towering moral and intellectual integrity. Her mother was Elizabeth Harman, who, as the Countess of Longford, would become a celebrated historian and biographer in her own right, long before her daughter achieved fame. She was a brilliant Oxford-educated scholar, known for her masterful biographies of Queen Victoria and the Duke of Wellington. She was the intellectual anchor of the family, a woman of immense discipline, wit, and quiet strength, who managed a chaotic household of 8 children while pursuing a demanding literary career. The Longford household was, by all accounts, a boisterous and exhilarating place to grow up. It was less of a traditional aristocratic home and more of a perpetual high-minded, debating society. The dinner table was a battleground of ideas where the children were not only encouraged but expected to voice their opinions on politics, religion, literature, and history, and to defend them with intellectual rigor. The atmosphere was intensely verbal, competitive, and stimulating. This was the Pakenham crucible, a formative environment that forged in Antonia a razor-sharp mind, a deep love of history, and an unshakable intellectual confidence. The family was also known for what the press dubbed the Longford look, a distinctive combination of striking physical beauty and an aura of intense, almost intimidating, intelligence. Antonia, as the eldest, was a prime example. She was tall, with classical features and an air of aristocratic poise. But it was the fierce intelligence in her eyes that truly set her apart. Her formal education began at the Dragon School, a progressive prep school in Oxford, and continued at St. Mary's Ascot, a leading Catholic girls' boarding school. But the most significant phase of her intellectual development came at the University of Oxford, where she attended Lady Margaret Hall, one of the first colleges for women. She arrived in the early 1950s, a time when Oxford was still a predominantly male world, and the presence of intelligent, ambitious young women like Antonia was still a relative novelty. She read history, immersing herself in the subject that had been the backdrop of her entire life. Her time at Oxford was not just an academic pursuit, it was a declaration of her own intellectual identity, a step out from under the long shadows of her accomplished parents. Parallel to this serious intellectual life, however, was the traditional path expected of a young woman of her class. In 1950, she was a debutante, coming out into society and being presented at the court of King George VI. This involved a grueling round of balls, cocktail parties, and country weekends, a ritual designed to introduce young aristocratic women to suitable husbands. For Antonia, it was a world of fascinating contrasts. One night she might be dancing at a magnificent ball at a ducal palace. The next day, she would be in a dusty Oxford library, wrestling with medieval charters. This duality, this ability to move seamlessly between the worlds of high society and high intellect, would become her defining characteristic. She learned to observe the rituals of the elite with the detached, analytical eye of a historian, a skill that would prove invaluable. It was during this period of her life as one of London's most beautiful and intelligent debs that she met Sir Hugh Fraser, a man who seemed to embody the other side of her world. He was a handsome, charming Scottish aristocrat from a distinguished Roman Catholic family. He was also a rising star in the Conservative Party, a member of Parliament who would go on to serve as a junior minister in several governments. He was worldly, confident, and deeply embedded in the British establishment. Their courtship was a society affair, and their marriage in 1956 was a major event. It was seen as a perfect union, a beautiful, brilliant aristocrat marrying a handsome, ambitious politician. The wedding, held at the historic St. Edward James's Spanish Place in London, was a grand affair, a gathering of the political, social, and literary elite. The marriage was also a fascinating alliance. Antonia was the daughter of a leading Labour peer, a socialist. Hugh was a proud Tory. Their union was a testament to the fact that, in the upper echelon of British society, class and religion could often trump political differences. For Antonia, the marriage marked the beginning of a new chapter. She was now Lady Antonia Fraser, the wife of a Tory MP, and soon to be the mother of a large family. She was expected to be a brilliant society hostess, a supportive political wife, and a devoted mother. And while she would fulfill all these roles with her characteristic flair and energy, she had no intention of letting her own formidable intellect lie dormant. The experiences of this new life, the insider's view of political power, the demands of motherhood, and the continued observation of the human drama of high society were all just gathering material. The historian was in training, and the world was about to hear her unique and captivating voice. The marriage of Antonia Pakenham to Sir Hugh Fraser in 1956 was more than just a society wedding. It was the beginning of a new, complex, and demanding chapter in her life. She was now Lady Antonia Fraser, a title that came with a specific set of expectations. She was the wife of a rising conservative politician, a position that required her to be a brilliant hostess, a discreet confidant, and a flawless public consort. She was also about to become the mother to a formidable dynasty of her own. To the outside world, she seemed to be settling into the comfortable, prescribed role for a woman of her class and beauty. But beneath the surface of this seemingly conventional life, an intellectual fire was being stoked. The young woman forged in the Pakenham crucible was not content to be merely an observer. It was in this whirlwind decade of politics, parties, and parenthood that she would undertake the immense secret labor that would transform her from a society beauty into a literary lioness and change the course of her life forever. Stepping into the role of a political wife, Antonia found herself at the very heart of the British establishment. Sir Hugh Fraser was a respected figure in the Tory party, a man of principle and ambition who would serve as a junior minister under Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. Their life was a carefully calibrated dance between their London home and their sprawling estate in Scotland, Eilean Igas, a picturesque island in the River Bowley. Both homes became hubs of social and political life. Antonia, with her innate charm, sharp wit, and the social confidence bred into her from birth, excelled as a hostess. Their dinner parties were legendary, a coveted invitation for the movers and shakers of the era. The guest lists were a heady mix of conservative grandees, diplomats, journalists, artists, and writers. This was not the idle chatter of the purely social set. This was the conversation of power. Around her own dinner table, Antonia had a front row seat to the intimate mechanics of government. She listened as policy was debated, as alliances were forged and broken, as reputations were made and destroyed over coffee and brandy. This experience was an unparalleled education for a future historian. She was learning in real time that history is not an abstract force, but the result of human ambition, vanity, loyalty, and betrayal. She saw how a casual remark could influence a political decision, how a personal rivalry could shape a national policy. She was observing the very essence of what makes history tick, the messy, unpredictable, and deeply personal interactions of the people in charge. This is where the first half of Truman Capote's observation, gossiping as if she were writing epics, began to take shape. She was living inside the very world of elite gossip that drives power. But unlike a mere socialite, she was processing it all with the analytical mind of an Oxford-trained historian. She understood that the private conversation was often more important than the public speech, and that the whispers in the corridors of power were the first draft of the history books she would one day write. She was not just hosting parties, she was conducting field research into the timeless nature of the human political animal. While her public life was one of elegant dinner parties and political functions, Antonia's private life during this period was a domestic epic of an entirely different sort. Between 1958 and 1966, in the space of just 8 years, she gave birth to 6 children, 3 daughters, Rebecca, Flora, and Natasha, and 3 sons, Matthew, Damien, and Orlando. This explosion of motherhood was a formidable undertaking, a feat of physical and emotional endurance that is often glossed over in accounts of her glamorous life. To manage a household with 6 children under the age of 8, even with the nannies and household staff that were a given in her class, was to live in a state of beautifully orchestrated chaos. Her life became a complex logistical operation, a whirlwind of school runs, childhood illnesses, birthday parties, and the constant, delightful, and exhausting demands of a large and lively family. This experience profoundly shaped her, grounding her in the fundamental realities of human life and relationships. This period is crucial for understanding the woman behind the public figure. It dismantles the stereotype of the detached, aloof aristocrat. By all accounts, she was a deeply engaged and loving mother who, like her own parents, fostered an environment of intellectual curiosity, lively debate, and creative expression for her children. Her home was filled with books, games, and the constant thrum of activity. But this domestic epic also presented a profound challenge to her own ambitions. In the Britain of the early 1960s, it was still the overwhelming expectation that a woman in her position, especially one with such a large family, would dedicate herself entirely to her husband and children. The idea of pursuing a serious, time-consuming professional career was not just unusual, it was seen by some as eccentric, even a dereliction of her primary duties. The internal conflict she must have felt, the deep love for her children, and the simultaneous burning desire for an intellectual life of her own, was a struggle that many women of her generation faced, but one that she navigated on a grander scale. This juggling act required immense discipline, a carefully compartmentalized mind, and a will of iron. It was a quiet, personal battle fought not in the halls of Parliament, but in the early, silent hours of her own home, long before the first child had woken up. It was a battle she was determined to win. Antonia's journey to becoming a professional historian did not happen overnight. It began with an apprenticeship in the world of publishing. She took a job working for the influential publisher George Weidenfeld of Weidenfeld and Nicholson. This was more than just a hobby. It was a serious entry into the literary world. She worked as a reader and editor and eventually as the general editor of a series of historical books. This role was her postgraduate education. She learned the craft of publishing from the inside, commissioning works, editing manuscripts, and developing a keen sense of what made a history book not just scholarly, but also commercially successful. It was during this time that the idea of writing a major work of her own began to take hold. She was drawn to the tumultuous and tragic life of Mary, Queen of Scots. The choice of subject was deeply personal and intellectually strategic. Mary was a figure of perennial romantic fascination, a queen whose life was a dramatic tapestry of love, betrayal, murder, and political intrigue. But she was also a serious historical figure whose story involved the complex religious and political struggles of 16th century Europe. For Antonia, Mary resonated on multiple levels. As a devout Catholic herself, Antonia was drawn to the story of a Catholic queen struggling to rule in the fiercely Protestant world of John Knox's Scotland. As a woman navigating a male-dominated world, she felt a deep empathy for a female monarch trying to assert her power against a backdrop of ruthless political ambition. And as a natural storyteller, she recognized that Mary's life contained all the elements of a great epic: tragic heroine, a formidable rival in Queen Elizabeth I, and a dramatic, heartbreaking final act. Having chosen her subject, she embarked on the project with the fierce discipline that would become her trademark. This is where the second half of Capote's observation, writing epic, finds its roots. There was nothing gossipy or lightweight about her methodology. She threw herself into years of painstaking research, a true scholarly undertaking. She spent countless hours in archives and libraries, from the British Museum to the National Library of Scotland. She read the primary sources in their original languages: French, Latin, and Scots. She did not just retell an old story, she went back to the original documents, re-examining the evidence with a fresh and critical eye. The most legendary part of this story is how she accomplished this monumental task while raising 6 small children. The anecdote of her rising at dawn is not an exaggeration. It was a necessity. She would wake in the pre-dawn darkness in the silent hours while her husband and children slept to enter the 16th century. For a few precious hours each day, her world was not one of school uniforms and breakfast, but of coded letters, political conspiracies, and the tragic fate of a captive queen. Then, as the house began to stir, she would put away her research, resume her role as mother and hostess, and return to the 20th century. This incredible act of will, this daily partitioning of her own mind, is a testament to the passion and determination that fueled her. After years of this disciplined labor, Mary, Queen of Scots was published in 1969. The result was a literary phenomenon. The book was an instant and massive bestseller both in Britain and internationally. But more importantly, it was a critical triumph. Serious academic historians who might have been tempted to dismiss a work by a society beauty were forced to praise its meticulous research and its balanced, nuanced arguments. The reading public was captivated by its narrative power, its psychological insight, and its ability to make the distant past feel immediate and intensely human. The book won the prestigious James Tait Black Memorial Prize for Biography, one of Britain's highest literary honors, cementing her reputation as a serious and important historian. The success of Mary, Queen of Scots was a profound personal and professional vindication. At the age of 37, Antonia Fraser was no longer simply the daughter of the Earl of Longford or the wife of Sir Hugh Fraser. She had forged a powerful identity of her own, built not on birth or marriage, but on the fruits of her own formidable intellect and discipline. The young lioness had found her voice, and it was the voice of a historian who could indeed turn the secrets of the past into a best-selling epic. The phenomenal success of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1969 was a watershed moment. It did not just launch a career, it announced the arrival of a major new cultural figure. Antonia Fraser was no longer simply an aristocratic wife who wrote on the side. She was now, in her own right, a literary superstar. The publication of her book was the culmination of a decade of quiet, disciplined labor, but it was also the beginning of a new, far more public and complicated chapter of her life. She had successfully navigated the demands of marriage and motherhood to forge a powerful identity of her own. The young lioness had emerged from her den not only with a critically acclaimed epic, but with a voice that the public was eager to hear. In the decade that followed, she would solidify her reputation as one of Britain's foremost historians, all while navigating the treacherous, intoxicating waters of literary celebrity. But as her public star ascended to dazzling new heights, her private world, the carefully constructed edifice of her marriage and family life, was about to face its own seismic shift. The epic was written, but the gossip was just beginning. The London of the early 1970s was the perfect stage for a figure like Antonia Fraser. The cultural landscape was vibrant, a heady mix of old establishment institutions and new rebellious energies. Television, particularly the BBC, had become a powerful medium for intellectual discourse, and producers were always on the lookout for commentators who were not only intelligent, but also telegenic. Antonia was, in this respect, a producer's dream. She was, of course, strikingly beautiful, possessing the cool, aristocratic poise of the Longford look. But when she spoke, she did so with a formidable intelligence, a quick wit, and an articulate passion for her subject that was utterly captivating. She was a historian who could have been a film star, and this unique combination made her a media sensation. She became a familiar and welcome presence on television arts programs and in the pages of glossy magazines and serious Sunday supplements. The public was fascinated by the paradoxes she embodied. She was a mother of 6 who wrote blockbuster biographies about doomed queens. She was the socialist Earl of Longford's daughter, yet she was married to a conservative MP. She was an insider of the highest echelons of society who wrote with a profound empathy for the outsider. This refusal to fit into any neat category made her endlessly interesting. She was not just writing history, she was making it, becoming a symbol of a new kind of woman who could seemingly have it all: a large family, a brilliant career, and a glamorous social life. Amidst this newfound fame, she embarked on her next major project, a decision that proved her serious scholarly ambition. Instead of choosing another romantic, tragic heroine like Mary, she turned her attention to one of the most complex, controversial, and distinctly unromantic figures in British history, Oliver Cromwell. He was the Puritan revolutionary, the regicide who had signed King Charles I's death warrant, the Lord Protector of England. To many in her own aristocratic class, he was a villain of the highest order. The choice was a bold, even defiant statement. It signaled that she was not merely a writer of historical romances, but a serious historian willing to tackle the most difficult and divisive subjects in the nation's past. The work on Cromwell would require her to delve even deeper into the art of historical biography, and in doing so, she would perfect the very method that Truman Capote had so astutely identified. Truman Capote's observation that Antonia wrote history as if she were gossiping round and gossiping as if she were writing epics is the key that unlocks her unique genius. It was not an insult, but a profound compliment that captured the essence of her revolutionary approach. Her work on Cromwell, published in 1973 to even greater acclaim than Mary, provides the perfect case study. The gossip in her method was not about spreading salacious, unfounded rumors. It was about her radical insistence on the importance of the personal, the intimate, and the psychological in the grand sweep of history. Before Antonia, biographies of figures like Cromwell were often dry, dominated by political, military, and constitutional history. They were about battles, acts of parliament, and religious doctrine. The man himself, his inner life, his relationships, his personal demons, was often a secondary concern. Antonia flipped this approach on its head. She understood that to truly comprehend Cromwell, the Lord Protector, one first had to understand Cromwell the man. She delved into his personal letters and the accounts of his contemporaries to piece together a deeply human portrait. She explored his loving and stable marriage to his wife Elizabeth, presenting it as a crucial anchor in his tumultuous life. She examined his close relationship with his mother and his deep grief at the death of his children. Most importantly, she took seriously his profound, all-consuming Puritan faith and his recurring bouts of what was then called melancholy, and would now be diagnosed as depression. This was the gossip, the texture of his daily life, his private sorrows, his family affections, his spiritual anxieties. She treated him not as a historical monument, but as a complex, living, breathing human being. She made the reader feel as if they knew him, as if they were hearing an intimate account of his life from a particularly insightful contemporary. But this is where the second half of Capote's line, as if she were writing epics, comes into play. She never allowed the personal details to remain mere anecdotes. Instead, she masterfully wove them into the grand, epic narrative of the English Civil War and the interregnum. She showed, with compelling force, how Cromwell's personal religious convictions were not just a private matter, but the very engine that drove his political and military actions. She argued that his belief that he was an instrument of God's will was essential to understanding his ruthless military campaigns and his radical decision to execute a king. She connected his personal melancholy to his political indecisiveness at key moments. She made the political deeply personal, and in doing so, she made the personal epic. Her biography of Cromwell was not just the story of one man, it was the story of how one man's inner world could topple a monarchy and reshape a nation. This method, this seamless blending of intimate psychological portraiture with grand historical narrative, was her great innovation. It was a style that was both intellectually rigorous and deeply empathetic, and it resonated powerfully with a public that was tired of history being presented as a dry list of dates and battles. She was proving book by book that the most effective way to understand the epic sweep of the past was to listen closely to its most intimate whispers. While Antonia's public life was a story of ever-increasing success and acclaim, her private world was quietly beginning to fracture. Her marriage to Hugh Fraser, which had begun with such promise in the 1950s, was entering a period of profound strain. They had married young, and in the nearly 2 decades that had passed, they had evolved into very different people, living increasingly separate lives. The sources of the strain were complex and rooted in the very success she had fought so hard to achieve. Antonia was no longer just the supportive wife of a politician. She was a major public figure in her own right. Her career was international, demanding long periods of intense solitary research, followed by book tours, interviews, and literary festivals across the globe. Her world was that of writers, academics, publishers, and artists, a bohemian and intellectually charged environment. Sir Hugh Fraser, meanwhile, remained a respected and dedicated backbench Conservative MP. His world was that of Westminster, of constituency surgeries, of the traditional male-dominated rituals of British political life. He was a man of great integrity and charm, but his interests and passions were not necessarily those of the literary world his wife now inhabited. While he was reportedly proud of her success, the sheer force of her career and her growing independence inevitably created a distance between them. It was not a matter of open conflict or scandal, but of a slow, creeping divergence. They were two people who had built a life and a large family together, who still cared for each other, but who found they had less and less in common. The shared intellectual and social world that had once united them was shrinking. The conversations around their dinner table were likely very different from the ones she was having with fellow writers and historians. This period must have been one of quiet, personal turmoil for Antonia. To have achieved such extraordinary professional success only to find a growing emptiness in her private life is a classic and painful dilemma. She had fulfilled the roles of wife and mother on a grand scale, and she had now forged a brilliant career. Yet it seems something was missing. The epic narratives of history and the lively gossip of the literary world could not entirely fill a void in her own private heart. She was a woman at the height of her powers, but she was also approaching a personal crossroads, one that would lead to the most dramatic and controversial decision of her life. The moment that would change everything came on the evening of October 8th, 1975. Antonia's sister, the novelist Rachel Billington, was hosting a dinner party to celebrate the opening night of a new play. The party was to celebrate the opening night of the play, Otherwise Engaged, directed by the most celebrated, enigmatic, and formidable playwright of his generation, Harold Pinter. If Antonia Fraser was a product of the aristocratic, Catholic, conservative establishment, at least by marriage, Harold Pinter was her polar opposite. He was the son of a Jewish tailor from Hackney in London's working-class East End. He was a giant of the post-war angry young men generation of writers who had revolutionized British theater. His plays were famous for their sparse, menacing dialogue, their undercurrents of unspoken violence, and their profound psychological tension. He was a man of the political left, fiercely intelligent, intense, and possessed of a smoldering, dangerous charisma. Antonia, then 43, and Pinter, 45, were both married and at the absolute peak of their respective careers. By all accounts, their meeting that night was a coup de foudre, a thunderbolt of immediate, mutual, and overwhelming recognition. Antonia would later write about it in her moving memoir of their life together, Must You Go? She described a conversation that was electric, an instant connection of minds and spirits that transcended the vast differences in their backgrounds. In him, she found an intellectual equal with a passion and an intensity that matched her own. In her, he found a woman of not just beauty and grace, but of immense intellect, strength, and a deep understanding of the human heart. They saw each other in that moment with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The dinner party ended, but something had irrevocably begun. This single meeting had ignited a passion that would lead to scandal, heartbreak, divorce, and ultimately one of the great literary love stories of the 20th century. The historian who had spent her life chronicling the passions and follies of the past was about to become the protagonist in an epic drama of her own. For the historian who had spent her life chronicling the great turning points of the past, the battles, the betrayals, the love affairs that altered the course of nations, the evening of October 8th, 1975, was a turning point of her own. The meeting with the playwright Harold Pinter was a coup de foudre, a thunderbolt that illuminated her entire world and threw her carefully constructed life into stark relief. She was Lady Antonia Fraser, a respected historian, a mother of 6, the wife of a knighted politician, and a pillar of the British establishment. He was Harold Pinter, the revolutionary playwright, the son of an East End tailor, a man whose work crackled with menace and unspoken desires. Their connection was as improbable as it was immediate, a collision of two worlds that would create a scandal, cause immense pain, and ultimately forge one of the great literary love stories of the age. The woman who wrote history as if it were gossip was about to find her own life becoming the most epic and talked about story of all. The connection ignited between Antonia and Harold Pinter that night was not a fleeting flirtation. It was an all-consuming fire. What followed was a passionate and clandestine affair that soon became an open secret and then a public scandal. The British press, with its insatiable appetite for the private lives of the upper classes, descended with a frenzy. The story was irresistible. The beautiful aristocratic historian leaving her Tory grandee husband for the brooding left-wing playwright. They were hounded by photographers, their faces splashed across the front pages of the tabloids. For Antonia, a woman who, despite her public profile, was accustomed to a degree of aristocratic privacy, the experience of being at the center of a media firestorm was brutal. The gossip she had observed and analyzed with such intellectual detachment was now aimed directly at her, and it was often vicious and judgmental. She was cast in the role of the Scarlet Woman, the faithless wife who had abandoned her family for a grand passion. But the public scandal, however unpleasant, paled in comparison to the private agony. The decision to leave her marriage and her children was the most difficult and painful of her life. She was a devoted mother, and the thought of breaking up her family caused her immense torment. Her husband, Sir Hugh Fraser, was a fundamentally decent man who was left hurt and bewildered by the force and finality of her decision. Their divorce was a protracted and painful affair, a quiet tragedy played out behind the sensational headlines. In her deeply moving memoir of her life with Pinter, Must You Go?, Antonia wrote with unflinching honesty about this period. She recounts the heart-wrenching moment of telling her children, the sorrow and confusion it caused, and the deep sense of guilt she carried. This was not a frivolous decision made on a whim. It was a choice that she felt, on the deepest level of her being, she had to make to save her own soul. But it came at a tremendous human cost. The fallout extended to her own formidable family. Her parents, the Earl and Countess of Longford, were devout Catholics, for whom divorce was anathema. Her father was deeply pained by her actions. It was her mother, the historian Elizabeth Longford, who delivered one of the most famous and insightful lines about the affair. Exasperated by her daughter's seeming disregard for convention, she reportedly said, "The trouble with Antonia is she thinks she is Mary, Queen of Scots, and can do whatever she likes." It was a brilliant, cutting, and deeply perceptive remark. It captured the sense of romantic historical self-dramatization that her critics accused her of, but it also hinted at the truth. Like her historical heroines, Antonia was choosing to follow her own heart, to defy the expectations of her world and to accept the dramatic and often painful consequences. The scandal also had a tragic victim in Harold Pinter's wife, the talented actress Vivian Merchant. Their marriage had been troubled for some time, but Pinter's affair with Antonia was the final blow. Merchant was left devastated, never truly recovering from the divorce, and she would sadly die from alcoholism just a few years later. This added a dark and complex layer to Antonia and Harold's love story, a reminder that their happiness was built upon a foundation that included real and profound suffering for others. After 5 years of turmoil, both Antonia and Harold were finally free. They married in 1980, and in doing so, they created not just a new family, but a new center of gravity in the London literary world. They bought a magnificent house in Holland Park, a leafy and exclusive London neighborhood, and it quickly became one of the city's most legendary literary salons. The atmosphere at their home, Campden Hill Square, was a unique blend of their two worlds. It combined the aristocratic grace, warmth, and social ease of Antonia with the fierce intellectual rigor, left-wing politics, and raw artistic intensity of Pinter. An evening at their home was an unforgettable experience. Guests could include anyone from Booker Prize-winning novelists and radical playwrights to labor politicians, visiting academics, and old friends from Antonia's aristocratic past. The conversation was always brilliant, the debate was often fierce, and the hospitality was legendary. Their relationship was a true partnership of equals, a deep and abiding connection of two formidable minds. They were each other's first and most important readers. Pinter would read the drafts of Antonia's meticulously researched biographies, offering his famously spare and incisive critiques. Antonia would read the drafts of his enigmatic and powerful plays, offering her own deeply insightful notes on character and motivation. They shared a profound intellectual respect and a deep, tender love that was evident to all who knew them. For Antonia, this new life was a profound fulfillment. She had found a partner who not only understood and supported her intellectual ambition, but whose own passion and intensity matched her own. After a life spent navigating the often conflicting demands of aristocracy, academia, marriage, and motherhood, she had finally integrated the different parts of herself. In her life with Pinter, the historian and the woman, the public intellectual and the private heart were finally one. She continued her incredibly productive career, publishing acclaimed biographies on subjects ranging from King Charles II to Marie Antoinette, each one a testament to her maturing skill and deepening insight into the human condition, an insight now profoundly informed by her own lived experience of great passion and great pain. The dramatic events of Antonia Fraser's personal life in the 1970s had a significance that extended far beyond the gossip columns. In choosing to leave her established, conventional life for a passionate, intellectual partnership, she became, for many, a reluctant feminist icon. At a time when the women's liberation movement was challenging traditional gender roles, here was a woman in her 40s, a mother of 6 from the heart of the establishment, who was insisting on her right to personal and emotional fulfillment. Her actions, taken at great personal cost, were a powerful statement that a woman's identity did not have to be solely defined by her role as a wife and mother. Lady Antonia Fraser revolutionized popular history by proving that it could be both commercially successful and academically serious. Her own life mirrored her work. Her scandalous affair with Harold Pinter evolved into a profound love story, perfectly illustrating her central thesis that intimate personal choices can have epic consequences. Fraser's dual legacy is a remarkable body of work that forever changed the genre and the inspiring example of a life lived with immense intellectual honesty and emotional courage, proving that the human heart is history's most powerful engine.